All right, it's 5 o'clock, so let's get today's event started. Good afternoon, all of you, and welcome to today's talk. The talk today is co-sponsored by the Program in Historic Preservation and the Department of Urban Planning. Our guest lecturer today is Michael. He is a trustee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where he served as vice chair of the Preservation and Science Committee and the Diversity Task Force. He also served as executive director and is a trustee of the Global Heritage Fund in Palo Alto, California, which works to conserve heritage sites as economic assets for developing regions of the world. He was previously the John Bryant Chair of Historic Preservation at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He has chaired the National Council for Preservation Education, the Geographic Society of Chicago, and served on the Executive Committee of Landmarks, Illinois. He serves on the board of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy as well. Vince began his career in 1983, working toward the creation of the first heritage area in the U.S. He is the author of The Architecture of Berrybine, Taking the Prairie School to Europe. Please join me in enthusiastically welcoming Vince to Ball State and the Department of Urban Planning.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Is my mic all right? Can you hear me? Are we good? Okay. Thank you very much, both programs, for inviting me here. I'm really welcoming the opportunity to come back to Ball State. And what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit history, because my first degree was as a historian, and I've been very interested in the history of what we call the historic preservation movement. I should say I've also been leading an effort, been involved in an effort for 5 or 6 years to rebrand it Heritage Conservation. But I think there's a really interesting history that takes place right around where we are here in Muncie, Indiana. And that's why Main Street, Madison, Indiana is up there on the screen, because there have been some significant changes in what we traditionally think of as historic preservation over the last 50 years, changes I'm still working on with many other people across the country, and changes that have implications not only to how it's practiced in this country, but really the way we look at heritage and culture across the world. So a couple quick questions. Why do we preserve? And I think traditionally, people who are trying to save great monuments of architecture or great historic buildings were motivated by things like loss. We're losing our history. We're losing valuable resources made of sustainable materials that can't be replaced. We're losing a connection to a place. We're losing a connection to an earlier society. We're losing a connection to our roots. Those are always ideas of loss. But as the movement to save historic buildings, towns, streetscapes, and resources has evolved, it's also been about opportunities, about the plus side of the equation, not what might be lost, but what might be gained. We're going to gain knowledge by taking something apart or putting it back together. We can use this as the basis, as we do here and many other places across this country and others, for education. When we restore historic structures in our cities, towns, and villages, we create jobs, and we can lead to economic revitalization. Those of you who I was talking to at lunch who mentioned Denver, this is Lodo in Denver. There's a wonderful quote from 50 years ago. By the way, this year is a big year of anniversaries. This is the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It's the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, 1916, which administers that act. And when they passed that act, the first thing they did was take a trip to Europe and make a nice coffee table book, and William Murtaugh had this wonderful quote in that book, that preservation engages the past in a conversation with the present over a mutual concern for the future. And this 50 years ago marked a shift. into how preservation was preserved, or was considered. It was considered an act of the future, an act of urban planning. If we look at the evolution of historic preservation, we think of those efforts in the 19th century, things like saving the home of Mount Vernon by the Anne Pamela Cunningham and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union. It was traditionally considered something very associational, patriotic, devotional. It was almost quasi-religious. The people in Texas, actually this is the first building saved west of the Mississippi. The Alamo was originally saved in 1883 in San Antonio, Texas. As the 20th century appeared, people started to get a little more technical and professional and scientific about it, and mostly they did that by bringing in architecture. And in the 1920s, the brand new profession of architectural history. So it shifted preservation to this idea of architectural greatness in history. And maybe you would save something not because a founding father lived there or because there was a great battle of the Revolutionary Civil War there, but because it was a wonderful example of architecture. And then an even more significant shift happened. That first shift was the early 20th century. By the 1920s, we see efforts, specifically in Charleston, South Carolina, in New Orleans, Louisiana, of people trying to save whole places, historic districts. They appear at the same time as zoning appears. Between 1916, the first modern zoning ordinance in New York, and 1926, when the United States Supreme Court upholds zoning, 591 communities covering some 30 million people adopted zoning ordinances. Most of those were residential suburbs, not big cities. And interestingly, at the same time the zoning ordinances were adopted, people started to think, well, if I can zone industry away from commerce, away from residents, maybe I can zone historic buildings so that there aren't new ones. And places like New Orleans and Charleston were already experiencing this because people were coming to visit them because of the new thing, the automobile. The automobile which ultimately makes zoning necessary. Once you have automobiles and trucks, you don't know which side of the tracks to live on. So you need zoning to tell you which is the good side of the tracks. In Charleston, the first place to do it, in 1931, they created their Old and Historic District. And they did it to manage tourism. Because the tourists were coming, but they were coming and they were like seeing, oh, there's a wonderful house, let me buy all the interiors and ship them up to Massachusetts. Or this is a beautiful place, let's do a road trip down here. Can we please tear down these buildings and build a gas station so we can service our motor cars? So Charleston did it to help manage tourism, and New Orleans did the same. And New Orleans was the first place where they, maybe just because of the French heritage, they came up with the idea of the tout ensemble, the whole thing. The whole thing is greater than the sum of its parts. We're not talking about individual monuments or landmarks, but something about a sense of place. And it's really a defining moment. It's a modern approach to preservation. It's about place. It's about not just a thing that could be in a museum. This is not something that could be in a museum. This is a place where people are living and working and doing things. So this was, in a sense, the first inkling that historic preservation was something about community planning, in my view. Historic districts were community planning tools. At the same time, in the 1920s, they were building colonial Williamsburg, not building, saving it, I guess, but also creating it as a historic village with the tableau of living history interpreters. A wonderful thing. It then was followed in the 1930s by Greenfield Village outside of Detroit, where Henry Ford, who said history was bunk, was able to present his own personal version of history. But there was something different in New Orleans and Charleston from colonial Williamsburg, because colonial Williamsburg was still following a curatorial model. The same way in a museum, you would create an artifact, conserve that artifact precisely, and present it in a very particular way. Whereas what New Orleans and Charleston were trying to do was keep the vitality of their community. Interestingly, what I consider the very first in the modern sense was Georgetown in 1950, and this one is complicated because this is in Washington, D.C., and it also had extremely racist motivations. What happened in Georgetown was what had happened in New Orleans and other places too. Someone wanted to build a highway right through the center of the neighborhood. This happens later in Brooklyn. It happens almost everywhere you see. In fact, someone could argue that these early highways, even proposed in the 20s and 30s, created a level of community organization that got these places riled up enough and organized enough to fight these big efforts to tear down all their buildings and eventually create historic districts. So Georgetown had been threatened by freeways, and because Georgetown was in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., it literally took an act of Congress to create their historic district, because they didn't have any home rule authority back in 1950. And also, interestingly, tourism was not really an issue. Charleston and New Orleans were obvious. Tourists have been going to New Orleans since the turn of the 20th century. Tourists went to Charleston. Tourists still go to both those places. Some tourists go to Georgetown now, but that wasn't the motivation. The motivation was much more about the community determining what it wanted to happen with its environment. Interestingly, this starts to gain legal traction. In 1954, we get the famous there's several famous U.S. Supreme Court decisions in 1954. That's obviously the year of Brown versus Board of Education. But in the urban planning field, we have Berman versus Parker. This was the quote they used in 1966, the right of cities to be beautiful. The idea was that a city needed to be, yes, well patrolled, it needed to be hygienic, but it could also be beautiful. That this was a legitimate legislative goal. It created an ability for some sort of aesthetic judgment on urban places. And interestingly, that Supreme Court decision led to two things, two different versions of that judgment. The version that said, great, we can make them beautiful, let's get rid of all that ugly and put in all modern Jetsons beautiful. And the other side said, they can be beautiful, great, let's keep all that beauty that's there. And essentially what goes on for the next 50 years is those two visions sort of fighting it out. How do you judge beauty? There were two groups that judged it different ways. This is a classic fight between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. Robert Moses, like, get rid of the old stuff, all new, beautiful. Jane Jacobs is like, keep the old stuff, it's beautiful. And then you had Beacon Hill in Boston, Massachusetts, become a historic district in 1955. Again, even though they were just behind the Common, not far away, their motivation was not tourism. And the more I look at these early historic districts and studied them, the more I realized that, in fact, most of these places had really been organized a lot before that, early in the 20th century. Usually they had created a zone, when the zoning ordinance first came to their town, whether it was Boston or New York or Chicago or whatever, these historic areas had been lower zoning than the rest of the town. So they already had been aware that they had something special and wanted to save it. So immediately after that Supreme Court decision, you get these two huge efforts that transform the American landscape. The Highway Act and the Housing Act. In the middle of the 1950s, this creates, of course, the huge interstates that we all know so well, and created urban renewal that we also know terribly well. This is one of my favorite images from Chicago of urban renewal. It illustrates a whole lots of things, including how it reinforced the racial divide by running a highway down between what was called the Black Belt and the predominantly white communities of Bridgeport and McKinley Park, and then reinforced that in the 1960s with huge amounts of high-rise public housing, all of which have since been demolished. But urban renewal led to a lot of calls for preservation. Urban renewal really takes off in the late 50s, and by 1966, when we have the National Historic Preservation Act, it's only been about 10 years of urban renewal, but it's already had enough of an impact that people are saying, wait a minute, we're just tearing down everything for all these highways in new urban renewal developments. Can't we do something about it? And that was the biggest impetus for the National Historic Preservation Act. That's a public impetus. You have two big public programs, highways, urban renewal, pushing, and then the Historic Preservation Act is a response to say, can't we save some of this? Can't we go through a review process at least? The story is going to shift away from the public sector after that, but for right now, that's where it is. It starts actually in Brooklyn, where they're also going to do a highway right through the middle of the neighborhood. And they were inspired by Beacon Hill. 1 year later, they said, let's be a landmark. So they said to the big organization in town, we want to be a landmark. And they said, great, okay, can you just wait till we get a landmarks ordinance for the whole city? So they waited 7 years. They managed to get Greenwich Village as another neighborhood that was very well organized, actually organized dating back to 1903. And they provided grassroots support for the preservation law, which the preservation community at the time thought was great, because the preservation community at the time are people that are architectural historians. They are elites. They read Stokes' Iconography of New York, written in the 40s, talked about all the great monuments. They were trying to consider ways to preserve all those great monuments built before 1918 only. And then they thought, well, a little grassroots support would help. And so they surveyed Brooklyn Heights, only looking at buildings built before 1860. And then they surveyed Greenwich Village. But Greenwich Village was, something else was happening. It was really community planning in the modern sense, where communities say, wait a minute, we want to have a voice in what we're doing and not just turn it over to the professionals. And yet you have the wonderful Jane Jacobs book coming out in 1961, right at the beginning of all this, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. To approach a city as if it were a larger architectural problem is to make the mistake of attempting to substitute art for life. A city cannot be a work of art, she said. It's a biological organism. It can't be defined by statistics. It can't even be defined by problems of simple chemical complexity, problems of large, random, scaled physical complexity. It's a biological problem where everything is interconnected. So community planning joins the preservation movement at that point. And here's how they did it. They proposed Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village had been popular. People had been rehabbing buildings in the 30s. People had been taking tour buses to go see Greenwich Village in the 1930s. It was called Greenwich Thrillage. You'd go see it. You'd go to a spaghetti bar. You'd go to a pirate bar. You'd go to these fun places. And then they brought in the architectural historians. So they marched around the neighborhood beautifully as they had done in Brooklyn. And they said, well, you've got an integrity problem here. You've actually got 18 separate historic districts, because we can't include all those high-rises that were built on the cut-and-cover subway lines in the 1920s, and we can't include all the new white brick high-rises that have gone up in the last 10 years. And we can't even include various multifamily buildings from the 1920s and 30s, so you've got 18 historic districts. And the people of Greenwich Village said, no, we're one place. And this went back and forth between 1965 and 1969, and the community won, and they still have, today, the largest historic district in the city of New York. And you could argue that it was a victory for the community. You could also argue that it was not a victory for the architectural historians. And it was interesting. I interviewed a lot of people when I was researching this, and I said to one guy who was actually on the Landmarks Commission at that time in the 60s, I said, why did they create the big district? How did they get away with that? And he gave me this great quote. The district had a lot of garbage in it. And the idea of the big district was that the junk would come under control and eventually get better. What an interesting statement. A couple things about that statement. One, it's completely future-oriented. This is not a curatorial statement at all. It's not about preserving some rare artifact. It's about saying this place can be better in the future. Interesting. So historic districts had, in my mind, by the mid-60s, nothing to do with colonial Williamsburg. And there we have my other favorite writer of the 60s, Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the first architecture critic for the New York Times. Purpose of preservation is not to recreate the past. And then she goes on to her own traumatic experience seeing a woman failing to do that at colonial Williamsburg when she was a child. So if the purpose of preservation is not to create the past, what is it? What it's really about, Ada Louise goes on to say, is the retention an active relationship of the buildings of the past to the community's functioning present. It's a very different idea. It's a very different idea from what Baron Haussmann was doing in Paris in the 1860s, where he was setting all the great monuments up as something to be looked at and admired and referenced at the end of the LA. This is part of Chicago's parallel to Greenwich Village, Old Town neighborhood. Went through the same sort of artistic ferment in the 1920s, had a lot of people fixing up houses, and quite frankly, as an architectural historian, this block is a bit of a mess. It could use some work. It could use some restoration. There's one building that has traditional integrity. But it was organized, and they used the same language when they designated it in the 1970s. They said, this will make the area better. That this heritage is a way to plan for the future. It's the model. So in 66, you get the big preservation laws. And they're there because, as this quote says, there was an understanding that zoning laws couldn't deal with historic buildings, especially in an era of highways and urban renewal. So you needed the Preservation Act. It was a basic government check on another government program. Now, the 1970s, now is when we get to the story that I really want to tell, because things shift more, and they shift more toward the private sector. First thing that happens about 1976, the bicentennial, we restore a lot of other buildings, especially as monuments. But at the same time, we create the first preservation tax incentives. And this is very interesting because it's a recognition that historic buildings can contribute a lot, but there's a bias against them in the real estate finance industry. So let's give them some incentives. And then we have the next step, which is Main Street. And the more I learn about Main Street, the more I'm fascinated by it. I'm very fortunate to have, as a friend, Mary Means, who in the Midwest office of the National Trust started the Main Street program with Scott Gerloff and some other colleagues back in the 1970s. And of course, Madison, Indiana was one of the first and most successful of the Main Street programs. Main Street was interesting because it took the next step. It had a 4-point program. And if you ask Mary about this, she will tell you, we were just trying to do something that worked. What could we do to save these main streets? Because all those highways and urban renewal were then followed by shopping malls. And everyone was going out to the shopping mall, so all the lovely Main Street businesses were going out of business. She's like, how can we save these buildings? And they had a 4-point program: design, organization, promotion, and economic restructuring. Interesting. Because in traditional preservation, design would have been the piece, right? Organization, promotion, economic restructuring. This looks like we've given ourselves a bigger brief, a bigger thing to do. And indeed they had. So yes, there was design about retaining important historic features, the basic principles of preservation and architectural design. Fix it. If it's not broke, fix it. If it is broke, fix it. If you have to replace it with the same thing or something that looks the same. And so you had things like this, or in the case, this case, remove a 1960s cheese grater facade to reveal an original 1860s Italianate. Find a building that had lost some of the pieces, like the cornice and the coins, and eventually restore it. So this is sort of the traditional ambit of historic preservation design. But it was non-curatorial. One of the things I learned most interestingly just in the last month, talking to Mary Means, she said, we never could have done it if the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment of historic properties had been done. They weren't done yet. Yes, it was 10 years after the National Historic Preservation Act, but the actual guidelines for what to do with your buildings hadn't been finished yet. So they were able to take a looser approach. Sure, someone could argue about quick print, but that's a local Texas landmark right there. Or someone could get upset about McDonald's being in that building. But you know what? The building's still being used. And nothing will save a building except use. But think about that. 4 points. One of them is design. So you've already reduced the traditional focus of preservation as curation to 1/4 of the program. So organization became a huge part of it. They realized that those suburban shopping malls, they were organized because they were under one ownership entity. So let's get the people organized. Sounds like community planning to me. Get everyone working collaboratively toward the same ends, volunteer recruitment, collaborate with partners. It's about people. You have a governing board of directors, committees to deal with various things. And it worked. The amazing thing was that it worked. Because people did want to save these resources, and they did want to do it in a practical, pragmatic way. In addition to organization, there was the idea of promotion, that you start to get the word out the same way the mall gets the word out. But that the Main Street had angles of promotion that suburban shopping malls couldn't have. Yes, they have convenience. Yes, they might have lower prices. But lower prices aren't every... I remember being in a Main Street workshop about 20 years ago, and the retail advisor talking, you guys are all the Main Street business owners. He said, you know what? 20% of the population will go out to Walmart or Costco or wherever it's cheapest. What is your response as a Main Street business? Live off the other 80%. Forget that 20%. There's enough, there are billions of dollars in that 80%. And so you promote the traditional pride, the buildings of your Main Street. And of course, nowadays promotion is on multiple platforms through multiple activities and multiple types of media. And finally, economic restructuring. This was the most pragmatic of them. The realization, just like that consultant story I told, that you couldn't do the same thing the shopping mall could do, but you could create a special product that had a great value and would be sustainable over generations. You had something that the mall could not offer. Figuring out how to make the best mix. And it took time, too, because sometimes you looked at the Main Street and it was a bunch of things that weren't competitive. The town I was in the mid-1970s, they tried to make a mall out of their old downtown, and it was like 20 shoe stores and 2 other stores. You know, and there were only so many shoe stores you could handle. Economic restructuring meant dealing with things like parking. What happens when the Bentley dealership closes up? And understanding that those things are going to continue to change. Now, fortunately, historic buildings, if they have good bones and come from the 19th century like these ones, can go through several uses. They are the original long-life, loose-fit buildings. But the amazing thing to me about that Main Street response was that it was remarkably successful. It was pragmatic. It existed mostly in the private sector and existed mostly outside of the traditional curatorial approach to preservation. Since 1980, Main Street has, you've got a couple thousand Main Street communities in the United States, $61.7 billion reinvested, 120,000 new businesses, 251,000 buildings rehabilitated. And for every dollar spent on it, it's returned $26, which is the biggest thing, because the other problem, of course, with mass retail on the edge of town is that it draws dollars out of the community rather than circulating them in the community. Next step, heritage areas. This is where I come into the story. My first project, as Michael explained, was working on the first heritage area. This was the idea in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan came into office. The idea was that government was getting smaller again. So this trend away from the public sector that had already started with Main Street was probably a good thing for preservation. So they moved on to the next thing. The next thing was the public-private partnership. It was a shift in scale and the public role. On the one hand, it scared all the people who like small government because he said, okay, we're going to designate 450 square miles of northeastern Illinois as some sort of new national park. And on the face of it, that could be very frightening. But it didn't mean that at all. It was simply a partnership park. It required almost no money. It required no federal land ownership. It required no new regulation. And it had 4 points, not the same as Main Street. One was historic resources. Here was a place where you had these historic towns that, you know, in the 1970s and 80s looked as they had 70 or 80 years before. You had historic buildings from the 1870s that were still there and could be restored. Already some of these towns had saved their buildings, important buildings. Lockport Central School was saved in 1980 along with a wonderful vaudeville movie palace, the Rialto Square Theater in Joliet, also saved in 1980. In addition to historic resources, however, they also had interest in natural resources. This had been a very industrial corridor outside of Chicago. And if you ever look closely at this issue, you find if you want to find rare, undisturbed natural areas, you actually look in industrial corridors, because that's the only place land gets left alone. If it's out there, it gets farmed. If it's near a town, it gets built on. The only place it gets left alone is where it's not popular. They had found 40 natural areas of significance in the area. And there were recreational resources dating back to the first state park at Starved Rock on the Illinois River. So they looked at two models. They looked to the model both from the late 1970s. One was Lowell National Historic Park in Lowell, Massachusetts, which had taken a bunch of old industrial buildings and made them a national park. And the other was the Cuyahoga National Recreation Area in Ohio, which connected to a green belt of various resources together. And they created this new thing with a horrible long name, Illinois-Michigan Canal National Heritage Corridor. And there you can see it signed into law by President Reagan in August of 1984. And it had these four goals: historic preservation, natural area conservation, recreation, and economic development. And like Main Street, it sort of worked. You saw buildings restored. This is the Gaylord Building, which became the first adaptive reuse property of the National Trust in 1996. Another 1850s house restored. This one is wonderful. It's like Adams Family Mansion from 1874, now fully restored. And it had its own Main Street programs. 3 of its towns had Main Street programs. And these worked as well. They're also interpreting the history of the place in places like Navy Pier and along the canal itself with a variety of different types of banners, figures, and mile markers, and connected the corridor to a 551-mile trail around the northern part of the state of Illinois. And it continues. They're reclaiming the old Joliet Arsenal, where dynamite was made from the first half of the 20th century, into a prairie park. And then this heritage area idea took off. Within 20 years, there were 40 heritage areas across the country. You can find them everywhere. There's a National Aviation Heritage Area. There's other canals that have become heritage areas. My favorite is Rivers of Steel. It's got some really good graphics. So the idea of heritage areas was popular because it was a public-private partnership. It essentially meant there was no more money directed towards something, but it created this sort of interpretive spine that you could build off of. I had to testify at Congress 20 years ago, and they asked me about this, and I said, you know, they keep saying, well, you don't need any money, you don't need, why is this important? I said, okay, I got a park outside of Joliet. We have some of the oldest blast furnaces from 1906. Part of it is owned by the state of Illinois. Part of it's in private ownership. Part of it's owned by the County Forest Preserve District. And part of it's owned by the municipality. How am I going to get them all to work together unless it has this national imprimatur, saying there's a story we're all working on? So you're able to focus resources through this heritage area idea. So this has continued to expand, and it's actually a couple final words about Main Street and heritage areas, and then we're going to leave the a minute. So what's exciting to me is that Main Street and heritage areas understood how real estate worked. Real estate is an interesting economic asset. Most economic assets have internal value. This microphone that I'm speaking through has a value because it makes my voice louder, and you can use it in different places in different environments. These chairs have value to sit on. A car has value because it takes you from one place to another. A building only has value because its neighbors have value. And if its neighbors have no value, it has no value, no matter how beautiful it is, no matter how much wonderful stuff it has. I bought a Frank Lloyd Wright house for $1 in 1992 for Landmarks, Illinois. I spent $40,000 too much because the neighborhood it was in had a negative value. There are people right now fighting historic districts in Michigan and Wisconsin who don't understand that basic function of real estate. So Main Street and heritage areas understood how real estate development worked. You start to create a story that connects places together like heritage areas. You start to organize people around a whole district like Main Streets. Dominoes start falling up rather than falling down. You restore one, hey, it grants value to the whole block. You restore another, all of a sudden the block has more value. And they also did something else. Besides having a better understanding of real estate economics than traditional curatorial approaches, they also involved the community. Think about Main Street. Organization, promotion. It's all about involving the people. Historic districts, despite what they're saying in the neighboring state to the north, community boards. They're in talk about what's going to happen next, what's going to get taken down, what's not. The same guy who started the heritage area concept in Chicago in 1983, actually, original study done around 1980, created in 84, started working in Yunnan, China in the 1990s, and eventually created something there as part of the Yunnan initiative that came out of the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange at Columbia University called the Weishan Heritage Valley in this little town in far southwest Yunnan on what's known as the Southern Silk Road. And the idea of this was to do the same thing, combine nature, a surrounding an agricultural valley, a historic downtown, to promote conservation of all those elements and do tourism in a sustainable way, which if you've been to China has been done in many cases in non-sustainable ways. Very interesting area, far southwest of China, only incorporated into China during the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Very diverse area where the minorities are actually in a majority. It has a wonderful temple mountain with 22 Taoist and Buddhist temples on it. This is one that's a national landmark and was restored. That's Mr. Xiao demonstrating the flute in Tai Chi. And the historic town was centered on the Southern Silk Road. And if you look at what is happening there, you can see the lessons of Main Street. Okay, here's a wonderful historic monument. Sadly, this thing burned a year ago, but it's been meticulously reconstructed. It's 13 years older and just a little bit smaller than Tiananmen in Beijing. Did I go the right way? Yeah. So what did it take from the heritage area? The idea of bringing history, nature, and economic development together. And the mission was to save the history, the urban life, the sacred mountain, the nature, the agricultural valley. And to keep it economically viable by having multiple things happening at the same time. Because what had happened in a lot of other places, they became a World Heritage Area and then decided, oh, tourism. So they snapped the thing into tourism monoculture. Kick all the people out, put in nothing but tea shops, silver shops, and scarf shops. That works fine unless the tourists don't come one year, and then the whole thing goes to heck. So they did all sorts of rules about the central downtown, preserving the buildings, using local paving stone, doing design guidelines, traditional wooden doors rather than steel shutters. Made efforts to save traditional businesses. The big ones in town were the funerals, coffin makers, noodles, things like that. And then we did some specific restoration projects on certain monumental buildings like the Dongyu Temple. By this time, we're approaching our own era, and about 5 years ago, we started to see world approaches to preservation recognizing the importance of heritage as a development tool. UNESCO, Power of Culture for Development, 2010. A year later, ICOMOS, Declaration on Heritage as a Driver of Development. Culture now considered the fourth pillar of sustainability after economics, social, and environmental. And this really represents an evolution in international preservation philosophy. You start out with the Athens Charter of 1931, which says, save things, throw some concrete on them if you want. And then you get to Venice in 64, which is right before our law, which really says, well, we should save the different periods of times, but it's still a monumental approach. That shifts significantly in 1994 with the Nara document, which really starts to incorporate other ideas of what is authentic and real. That's a Shinto temple in Ise, Japan, right? It's 1,000 years old, but it's torn down every 18 years, and a new one is built next to it. It's a different idea of transmission of culture. And the Nara document started to bring that idea into the international conservation discussion. That's continued with things like the ICH Convention of 2003 and the Xi'an Declaration of 2005. And basically what it breaks down to is that preservation is no longer a thing where some expert tells you how to preserve an object and then put a label on it and put it behind glass. But conservation is actually an active process whereby a community is brought into the process of identifying what is significant in their past culture, evaluating how significant it is compared to other things, and helping determine how you bring it to the future. Yes, you can have experts at every stage, but the community has to be involved at every stage. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. Identify, evaluate, register, treat. If you look at the National Historic Preservation Act, that's how it's described. It's a process. But if you start thinking about preservation as a process, identify what's important. Is it a building? Is it a place? Is it a ruin? Is it a pathway? Is it a mountain? How do you evaluate it in relation to other elements of the culture or history? How do you register it or landmark it? And then finally, what is the appropriate treatment? Do you chop down everything but the facade and put an 80-story building behind it? Because that happens. Do you use traditional materials? Do you use original materials? What are the different ways you treat something? That's not going to be identical from place to place and from culture to culture. In fact, that's what's beautiful about it, because it's culture specific. It's the opposite of zoning. Like saying, okay, I'm coming to you. What is specific about your place? And how can we bring these specific things into the future? It's the sort of thing lawyers hate. Lawyers are all about precedent. It's saying there is no precedent. Everyone's treated as an individual. So if you think about preservation this way, it's how a community engages with its roots, because the community helps determine significance. It helps bring the elements into the future. This engages more kinds of history, because it's not just the history of architectural historians or design historians like myself, I'm one, but it's also people. This is very important when you're dealing out west with Indian tribes. I spoke at the National Conference of Tribal Preservation Officers last August. And it's really interesting there because it's a whole different set of resources, and it's all about continuity with the present. And if you consider a process, you can identify more types of threats, like climate change. If you consider it a process, you can think of more types of adaptation than house museum. The process of preservation is adaptive and resilient. It understands that there's more than one way to get to the future. And we're going to prioritize what needs to get to the future. And finally, the point of everything I've said is it promotes community development. Now, I'm just going to run through a couple quick slides of Global Heritage Fund and then wrap it up so we have time for questions. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes. I ran Global Heritage Fund for 3 years, and I'm still involved on their advisory board, which I've been involved for over 8 years, and their board of directors. And they, again, have an approach that is 1/4 traditional conservation science, if you will. And the rest is planning, partnerships, and community development. Why? Because if you want something to survive into the future, the community's got to be invested in it. It's got to be their project. I've been involved in projects where a rich person came in and saved a wonderful historic resource in a community and spent $3 million restoring it and gave a $4 million endowment. And that's just wonderful. Everything's solved, right? Problem over, right? Except when something goes wrong. And then you ask the community, don't we want to save this? They're like, no, that's his problem. It's not ours anymore. We worked in Pingyao, China, which is the walled city in Shanxi, and restored a couple courtyard houses, and then leveraged that into a large program that restored more than 40 courtyard houses. We worked at this wonderful site in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta Mountains on the Caribbean coast of Colombia called Ciudad Perdida that dates from the 7th through early 15th centuries in a separate mountain range between the Andes and the Central America, where these marvelous earthenware platforms were built by the Tairona people. And we even built new structures there, like a community health center, because that's what was needed. We worked at the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which, if you haven't heard of it, is fascinating. It's 12,000 years old. It's the first ceremonial site with carved zoomorphic and anthropomorphic figures arranged in great giant circles by hunter-gatherers millennia before settled agriculture and deliberately buried. And we worked at a place I was at just this last June, the Carpathian villages of Romania, which are like stepping back into a Hansel and Gretel fable. And in each case, community development was a goal, but community involvement was essential if we knew that goal was going to survive. Final project I'm going to mention, Guizhou, China, where we're working in traditional minority villages, conserving not just buildings, not just a sense of place, but all traditional crafts, in this case, paper making. And there's a traditional drum tower. So I'm just going to leave you with this idea, because I've talked a lot about community development. And I sometimes get pushback from people saying, no, you want economic development, you want a factory. You want an oil refinery, right? Well, I think people here know, thanks to Carrier, that these things can be moved. They're not permanent. Are you going to move the Great Wall of China or the Taj Mahal? If you can make that an economic generator, it's sustainable. So we save buildings and historic sites because of a relationship of people and place, because they inspire human investment, not just money investment, but people's time investment. If you look at Main Street, if you look at historic districts, it's all about volunteers putting in time, trying to save something or promote an idea. Over generations, what's going to work over time? A factory, an oil refinery, who knows? A historic building, a historic place that has a sense of its past and future will work. So heritage provides a point of reference, an element of identity, and a source of pride in the original sense, but it also provides a way to promote our economy, our community, and our basic humanity. Thanks so much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yeah. How many countries have been to the different project? If you include speeches and stuff, maybe 15 or 16. Yeah. Two reasons. One, I think heritage conservation is what's used, and Michael, you correct me, in the rest of the English-speaking world. That's the more common phrase. I think it's a little more accurate. Second is the connotation. Historic preservation over time has drawn up the connotation of these weird ladies who want to tell me what color to paint my house, you know, even though that really doesn't happen anywhere, but but that's the perception. So there are two reasons. One is to be in concert with the phrase used in Australia and England and Ireland and South Africa and so forth. And the other, and I think it's more accurate, because when I'm talking about larger collections of resources and approaches to culture, heritage makes a lot more sense. So, yeah.
I don't know how to deal with this, but I'm just curious if people are thinking about reacting back to now cultural heritage and heritage shops being used as targets. And is
Oh.
there a movement or something?
Like in Syria and stuff? Yeah. No, that's a really good question. So, and we are involved in that in Global Heritage Fund. So yeah, you have groups like ISIS or Daesh or whatever we're supposed to call them now, who are deliberately targeting cultural artifacts like everything from Abraham's tomb to sites in Homs, Syria, and other places in Syria, where they're destroying precious ancient artifacts because they are because they're against culture, you know. And you saw it, I mean, quite frankly, it happened in World War II. It's happened at other times. Unfortunately, in history, a lot of histories, you know, there were periods where people went through iconoclasm. There's almost no culture that didn't have an iconoclastic period if you go back far enough. So there is a concern. Are you, okay, so the question becomes, if I make my neighborhood a historic district and my barbershop part of a main street, am I creating a target? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so in fact, I am in touch. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on specifically with the problem in Syria and Iraq, where there has been active wanton destruction. And a couple things to note about it. One, there's always a monetary role. It's not always ideological. So in other words, you didn't hear about any of that destruction for the first 2 years ISIS was there. That's because they were spending all that time with the stuff they could pick up that was portable, and they were selling it. And once they ran out of stuff that they could sell and smuggle across the border, that's when they started smashing up the big stuff, which they videotaped so they could monetize it by using it as a recruiting tool for young men of the banlieue or outskirts of London who like to smash things. So, but the answer, the positive response, we are working with people on the ground figuring out mobile encrypted platforms that can help people document things so they can be restored. Interesting bit of history. The first law anywhere in the world to document historic buildings was passed in the 1920s for beautiful measured drawings in Warsaw, which is why we were able to rebuild Warsaw after World War II, because we had these incredibly precise drawings. Yeah. No, well, as I was saying, historic preservation is a piece of heritage areas. So it's a specific piece. So what's happening, and that's why I use that one thing, saying a shift in scale. So you could argue, you could look just at scale. You could say, okay, preservation people started out with Mount Vernon and Paul Revere's house, and then they just moved to historic districts, and now whole cities and heritage areas. So it's just a question of scale. But with each of those steps, the actual curatorial piece that was everything in the first example gets smaller. And there are other concerns like recreational planning, economic development, things like that. So it's a piece of it.
Is there still a HAP program? And if so, how can students get involved with it?
Okay, so HABS was started back in the 30s. HABS is Historic American Building Survey. You can actually document a building and send it to the Library of Congress and make it part of the permanent record and have your name on it as delineator and be quoted forever. When I ran the program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, we would do one HABS documentation project a year. I didn't supervise it, but they would pick a historic building and do a set of 12 to 15 drawings that would then become part of the permanent record. So Historic American Building Survey are measured drawings that are done. They still require ink on Mylar. They do allow CAD now. It started all as hand-drawn, obviously. But they provide a permanent record of a building, and usually it's facade elevations, sections, some details, floor plans, reflected ceiling plans, sort of a basic set of drawings. And it's actually a wonderful experience because one of the things I mentioned early in the thing about knowledge, you know, when you actually have to get in or work on a historic building, you learn so much about construction and things like that. Even in modern buildings, it's fascinating. I've been involved with Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, which there was a brief picture of up there for many years. And they had this problem of what they called oxide jacking. It's a fancy word for rust. And, and there was this window, because it's big sheet glass, big, huge 10 by 10 pieces of glass in metal channels, and if the metal bends, well, it's going to break the glass, right? So they had this one corner, and they're like, oh, why is it so bad there? The water must be collecting there. Something's going on there. They finally pulled the thing apart, and you know what they found? Metal shims. So when they were putting it together in 1950, something was off by a little. And so they just put a little metal shim in there. The same way you'd put one behind when you're hanging a kitchen cabinet or something. So you learn so much when you get into a building.
Any more questions?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question. So I had the good fortune when I came into the field that I worked for the equivalent like, what do we call it now, Landmarks Indiana. All the organizations have changed their names since I started. So it used to be HLFI, and that's how I knew it for years. But I worked for the equivalent in Illinois. And as an advocate, I was supposed to try to save historic buildings. I had the good fortune of being able to support a lot of communities that were trying to save things. And there probably are such out there still. So part of it is to identify projects like main streets and historic districts that aren't there yet that communities want because they give them some sense of local control. And yes, there is a backlash now, but quite frankly, there was a backlash in the early 90s. There were people fighting against it and saying it's, what they're saying in Michigan and Wisconsin right now, which, like I say, is, I think, a misconstruing of it. So to be able to have one or two examples where you're on the side of the community and helping them in their efforts is the best possibility. That's hard to do if you're working in a state historic preservation office or for the National Park Service, but in a lot of other positions it is possible.
All right, let's give our thanks to Minister Kahn and sharing this knowledge with us.
Thank you.